Nora Colton had memorized every crack in the ceiling above her bed. 12 years of staring at the same water stain shaped like a broken wing had given her plenty of time to count them. 214 cracks. She knew because she had counted twice, once at 9 years old when she couldn't sleep, and again at 14 when she decided sleep wasn't worth the nightmares anyway. The morning she turned 18, no one threw a party. No one baked a cake. A woman from the county office showed up at 9:15 with the manila folder and a tight smile that said she had 6 more stops to make before lunch. She handed Nora a single sheet of paper listing 4 homeless shelters within a 30-mile radius, 2 of which Nora already knew had closed the year before. "You'll want to start with the one on Greenfield Avenue," the woman said, clicking her pen. "They have beds available through the end of the month." Nora folded the paper and put it in the front pocket of her backpack. The backpack was gray faded at the seams and held everything she owned. 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush with bent bristles, a paperback copy of a novel she had read 11 times, and tucked into the smallest zipper pocket, a single piece of paper she had carried since she was 10 years old. A note with no return address, no signature, just one line written in steady, old-fashioned handwriting. "Be patient. There will come a time when everything becomes clear." She had found it under her pillow one morning at the orphanage. No one on staff could explain where it came from. Nora kept it anyway. Not because she believed it, but because on the worst nights when the world felt like a room with no doors, even a stranger's lie was better than silence. The hallway of Briarwood County Home for Children smelled the way it always did. Floor wax and boiled vegetables, something faintly metallic that no one ever identified. Nora walked past the common room where a few younger kids were watching cartoons, their faces blank and blue in the television light. She had been one of them once, small and quiet and waiting for a family that never showed up. 3 couples had come close over the years. The first wanted a younger child. The second changed their minds after the home visit. The third, a kind-looking woman with red hair and her husband who smelled like pipe tobacco, had filled out all the paperwork. Nora had packed her things that night, her heart beating so hard she thought the other girls could hear it through the walls. The next morning, the social worker told her the couple had decided to adopt a boy from another facility instead. Nora learned something that day. Hope was just pain wearing a different coat. She stopped at the front door of the orphanage and looked back one last time. Her bed was already being stripped by a staff member. Fresh sheets for the next kid. That was how it worked. You aged out and the system kept turning like you were never there at all. Nora pushed through the front door and stepped outside. The late afternoon air hit her face crisp and sharp, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and exhaust from the highway a quarter-mile east. October in the lowlands of the mid-Atlantic still had warmth in it, but the shadows were getting longer. Winter was coming, and she had nowhere to sleep tonight. She made it exactly 4 steps down the sidewalk before the black sedan pulled up. It was the kind of car Nora had only seen in movies. Dark paint so clean it reflected the sky, tinted windows, chrome trim that caught the afternoon light like a blade. The engine idled with a low, expensive hum that didn't belong on this side of town. The rear door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than everything inside Briarwood combined. He carried a leather briefcase and wore the kind of calm, practiced spiel that Nora had seen on television lawyers and politicians. "Nora Colton," he asked. She didn't answer right away. 12 years in the system had taught her that strangers who knew your name usually wanted something. Who's asking? My name is Prescott. I'm with Holloway Prescott and Associates. We're an estate law firm based in the city. He paused, letting the words settle. We've been trying to locate you for some time. Nora stared at him. Estate law. That's correct. Somebody die. Prescott's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. Your grandfather, he said. Walter Colton. He passed away 4 days ago. The name meant nothing to Nora. She had no grandfather. She had no anyone. That was the whole point of aging out of foster care. You were no one's anything. I think you've got the wrong person, she said. Prescott opened his briefcase, removed a single document, and held it out. I assure you, Miss Colton, we do not. 30 minutes later, Nora was sitting in a conference room on the 20th floor of a glass tower in downtown Philadelphia. The chair beneath her was leather soft and cold. The table was polished oak long enough to seat 12. The air smelled like fresh paper and expensive coffee. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched out in every direction, glittering and indifferent. Nora kept her backpack on her lap. She hadn't let go of it since she sat down. It was the only thing in this room that belonged to her world. The door opened and 2 people walked in. The man came first. Tall, early 30s with a jaw that looked carved from granite and a watch on his wrist that caught the overhead light like a small sun. His suit was dark blue, tailored so precisely it looked painted on. He moved the way people move when they've never been told no. The woman followed a half step behind. Late 20s, sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled back so tight, it gave her face a sculpted, almost severe quality. She wore a cream-colored blazer and carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had been trained from childhood to sit up straight, smile at the right moments, and never show weakness. They sat down across the table from Nora without greeting her. The man glanced at her backpack, then at her face, then away, as if he had already made every judgment he needed to make. Sterling Colton, Prescott said, gesturing to the man. And Margot Colton, your cousins. Prescott paused and looked at Nora. For context, Miss Colton, your father David was one of Walter's 2 sons. David was the younger. The elder son, Philip, is Sterling and Margot's father. Philip passed away 6 years ago. David, as you may know, has been out of contact with the family for many years. Nora didn't flinch. She filed the information away without expression. So there had been 2 brothers, her father David, who had vanished, and Philip, who had raised Sterling and Margot inside the machine of the Colton family. 2 sons, 2 paths, and Nora was the wreckage left behind by the one who ran. Sterling leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. So this is the one. He said it the way someone might say, so this is the stain on the carpet. Margot said nothing. She looked at Nora for one long moment, and something flickered in her expression. Not warmth, not hostility either. Something Nora couldn't read. Then Margot turned her gaze to the window and kept it there. Prescott opened a thick folder at the center of the table. As outlined in the last will and testament of Mr. Walter Colton, Deceased October 7th of this year, the following assets and holdings are to be distributed among his surviving descendants. The reading took the better part of an hour. Sterling and Margot received the kind of inheritance that belonged in headlines: a luxury estate in Aspen, Colorado, a beachfront property in Malibu, controlling shares in 2 holding companies, investment accounts spread across 4 financial institutions, each one worth more than Nora could comprehend, trust funds, art collections, a vintage car collection stored in a private warehouse in Connecticut. Sterling's expression never changed during the reading. He absorbed each item the way a man accepts what he already believes he deserves. Margot kept her eyes on the window. Then Prescott turned to the final page. And to his granddaughter, Nora Colton. The room went still. Prescott slid a small envelope across the table. Nora picked it up. Inside were 2 things: a rusted key, old and heavy with teeth worn smooth by time, and a property deed, a single parcel of land in a rural county 2 states north, remote, mountainous, no structures listed. Sterling let out a short laugh. "Well," he said, leaning forward, "looks like the old man left the stray a camping spot." Margot's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Nora stared at the key in her palm. It was cold and rough against her skin. For a moment, everything around her, the glass walls, the polished table, the smug curve of Sterling's mouth, felt like a scene she was watching from very far away. Then she closed her fingers around the key and looked up. "Are we done?" Prescott nodded. "The transfer documents are in order. The property is yours, effective immediately." Sterling stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door without another word. Margot rose more slowly. She paused at the doorway and glanced back at Nora. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Then Margot turned and was gone. The conference room felt enormous with everyone gone. Nora sat alone at the long oak table, the rusted key still in her hand, the property deed unfolded in front of her. She read it 3 times. The coordinates meant nothing. The county name meant nothing. There were no buildings, no structures, no indication of what, if anything, waited for her at the end of that deed. She was about to stand when Prescott appeared in the doorway again. He looked different now. The professional mask had slipped just slightly, and beneath it was something that resembled concern. He walked to the table, pulled a folded slip of paper from his vest pocket, and placed it in front of her. "This was not part of the official reading," he said quietly. "Walter gave this to me separately, with instructions to hand it to you, and only you, after the others had left the room." Nora unfolded the paper. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the letters slightly shaking but deliberate. The same handwriting from the note she had carried since she was 10. "Do not trust what you saw in this room. Trust what you find on the mountain." Nora looked up. Prescott's face was unreadable. "I can't say anything more," he said. "I am bound by attorney-client privilege even after death. But I will tell you this." He paused. "Your grandfather was not a careless man. He did not do things without reason." Then he turned and left. Nora sat there for a long time after he was gone. She held the note in one hand and the rusted key in the other, and tried to make sense of a world that had just cracked open beneath her feet. She spent that night on a bench at the Greyhound station 2 blocks from the law office. The key sat heavy in her jacket pocket. The property deed was folded into a tight square in her bag. Around her, the station hummed with the quiet noise of transient life. A man sleeping across 3 seats with a newspaper over his face. A woman talking softly into a phone in a language Nora didn't recognize. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. Nora didn't sleep. She sat with her back straight and her bag against her chest, turning the key over and over in her fingers. The metal was rough where rust had eaten into its surface, but the teeth were still intact. Whatever lock this key belonged to, it had been made to last. By morning, the math was simple. She had $43 in cash, no job, no family, and a list of shelters she already knew couldn't help her. The property deed was the only thing in her life that had her name on it. She bought the cheapest ticket north. The bus left Philadelphia at 7:45 in the morning. Nora took a window seat near the back and watched the city shrink behind her. First the skyline sharp and silver against the pale October sky. Then the suburbs rows of identical houses with identical lawns and Halloween decorations already up in the windows. Then the strip malls and car dealerships and fast food signs that blurred together like the same mile repeating itself over and over. Somewhere past Allentown, the landscape began to change. The flat, cluttered sprawl gave way to rolling farmland. Silos stood in the distance like sentinels. The trees were turning. Maples blazed orange and red along the road, and the hills grew taller with every mile. By the time the bus crossed into upstate New York, the world outside was forest. Endless corridors of pine and birch pressed close to the highway, their canopies forming a green tunnel that filtered the afternoon light into shifting patterns on the road. The air coming through the cracked window smelled different, colder, cleaner, like rain and pine needles, and the kind of silence that only exists where people don't. 9 hours after leaving Philadelphia, the bus pulled into a gravel lot beside a faded sign that read Pine Ridge, New York. Population 1,247. Nora stepped off the bus and the quiet hit her like a wall. No traffic, no sirens, no construction. Just the sound of wind moving through tall pines and somewhere in the distance the low murmur of running water. The sky above was enormous, a deep blue ceiling streaked with the first purple bands of sunset. Pine Ridge looked like it had been built in the 50s and hadn't changed its mind since. A single gas station sat on the corner of Main Street next to a diner with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered in the fading light. Across the road, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign leaned slightly to the left, as if it were tired of standing. A post office the size of a garden shed. A church with a white steeple. That was it. Nora walked into the gas station to buy water. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a woman in her mid-60s, silver hair tied in a loose bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up the moment Nora entered, and something changed in her face. Not alarm. Something closer to recognition. For a few seconds, the woman just stared. "Passing through?" she finally asked. "Something like that," Nora said. The woman's gaze drifted to the worn backpack, then back to Nora's face. She studied her the way you study a photograph you haven't seen in years, searching for something familiar in the details. "You've got eyes like someone I used to know," the woman said. A faint smile appeared on her lips, but it was touched with sadness. "Name's Ruth. Ruth Hayward. Been running this station since before you were born." Nora paid for the water and a granola bar, the last of her cash. "I'm looking for a piece of land," she said, "somewhere up the mountain. I've got a deed but no directions." Ruth looked at her for another long moment. Then she pointed through the window toward the tree line at the edge of town. "Forest Road starts just past the old covered bridge. Follow it uphill about 4 miles. Trail splits at a creek bed. Take the left fork. You'll know when you've gone far enough." Nora thanked her and turned to leave. "One more thing," Ruth said. Nora stopped at the door. Ruth's voice was quieter now. "Mountains can be hard on a person who's not ready for them, but they're honest. That's more than most places can say." Nora pushed through the door and stepped back into the cooling air. She found the forest road just where Ruth described. The asphalt ended abruptly at the tree line, giving way to a dirt path barely wide enough for a vehicle. Within 10 minutes, Pine Ridge had disappeared behind her, swallowed by the forest, as if it had never existed. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. No cell signal, no distant highway hum, just the crunch of gravel under her boots and the steady rhythm of wind moving through the canopy above. Pine needles carpeted the ground in thick rust-colored layers. The air was sharp with resin and cold earth. The trail turned rough within the first mile, steep grades, loose rock, fallen branches that forced her to climb over or duck under every few hundred yards. The backpack dug into her shoulders and her legs burned from the incline. Nora was strong. Years of fending for herself had made sure of that, but the mountain didn't care about her strength. It tested something deeper: patience, will, the ability to keep moving when every part of your body was asking you to stop. She kept moving. Night came fast in the mountains. The sun dropped behind the ridge like a stone into water, and within 20 minutes, the forest was dark. Not city dark, where street lights and storefronts kept the night at a polite distance. Mountain dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything beyond the circle of her flashlight beam. Nora pulled the small flashlight from her backpack and clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow path through the trees. Shadows jumped and twisted around her. Somewhere to her left, an owl called. Somewhere ahead, branches cracked under the weight of something she couldn't see. She checked the deed under the flashlight. The coordinates on the map placed the property somewhere ahead, higher up the ridge past the creek, and beyond a stand of old-growth pines. She had been walking for nearly 3 hours. Her feet ached. Her throat was dry. The granola bar was long gone, and the water bottle was almost empty. For one brief moment, standing alone in the dark on a mountain she had never seen before, heading toward a piece of land left to her by a man she had never met, Nora allowed herself to wonder if this was all a cruel joke. The final punchline of a life that had never once given her a reason to believe things would work out. Then she tightened the straps on her backpack and kept climbing. 20 minutes later, the trees began to thin. At first, Nora thought her flashlight was playing tricks. Through the dark outlines of the pines, something appeared that didn't belong in the wilderness. Clean lines, right angles, a shape that was too deliberate, too purposeful to be anything made by nature. She slowed her steps. Then she stopped. It was a cabin. Not the broken-down hunting shack she had imagined during the 9-hour bus ride. Not a collapsed ruin or an abandoned shed held together by rust and spite. This was a real structure. Solid. Intentional. A wide cabin built from thick pine logs sat in a small clearing at the top of the ridge. Its roof was steeply angled, designed for heavy snowfall. Along the south-facing slope, solar panels caught the pale light of the rising moon. To the left of the cabin, a fenced area enclosed what looked like a greenhouse, its glass walls reflecting the moonlight like dark mirrors. A narrow wooden bridge crossed a small stream that ran behind the property, the water catching the light as it tumbled over smooth stones. A woodpile neatly stacked and covered with a tarp stood against the far wall of the cabin. Nora stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. Her flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. Not from cold, from something she didn't have a name for yet. "This can't be it," she whispered. She checked the deed again. The coordinates matched. The rusted key in her pocket felt heavier than it had all day. Slowly, Nora crossed the clearing. Her boots crunched on frozen grass. The cabin was dark, no light in the windows, no smoke from the chimney, no sign that anyone had been here recently. But it didn't feel abandoned. It felt like it was waiting. She stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under her weight, a low groan that echoed in the quiet clearing. Nora pulled the key from her pocket and looked at it one more time. Rusted, old, ordinary. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, clean click that seemed impossible for a key so old. The door swung open. The cabin smelled like cedar and old paper and the faintest trace of wood smoke, as if a fire had burned here not long ago and its ghost still lingered in the walls. Moonlight poured through two large windows, casting pale rectangles across a plank floor that had been swept clean. Nora stepped inside and let the flashlight move across the room. The interior was simple but deliberate. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel made from a single slab of rough-hewn timber. To the right, a small kitchen with a hand-pump sink and open shelving stocked with canned goods and dry staples. To the left, a wooden desk and a chair positioned beneath a window that would catch the morning light. Shelves lined the walls filled with books. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Old spines, leather covers, titles Nora could barely read in the dim light. The cabin didn't look abandoned. It looked prepared, like someone had built it, stocked it, and then walked away knowing that one day the right person would open that door. Nora moved deeper into the room. Then she froze. Above the fireplace, the wall was covered in photographs. Not a few. Dozens. Nora lifted her flashlight, and the beam swept across them slowly one by one, and with each image the air in her chest grew tighter. A small girl, maybe 5 years old, sitting on a rusted swing set. The playground at Briarwood. Nora recognized the cracked asphalt beneath the swing, the chain-link fence in the background. She recognized the girl too, because the girl was her. Another photo. Nora at 12, her lips split, and her left eye swollen, standing in front of the school principal's office. She remembered that day. 3 older boys had cornered a younger kid in the bathroom. Nora had walked in and hadn't walked away. She took the beating and gave back enough of one to make the boys think twice about doing it again. Another. Nora at 15, sitting alone in the orphanage library, reading by the window. She didn't know anyone had seen her that day. She didn't know anyone had been looking. And there in the center of the wall, the most recent one. Nora in her graduation cap and gown, standing on the steps of the county high school. She wasn't smiling in the photograph. She was looking off to the side as if searching the crowd for a face she knew wouldn't be there. Nora lowered the flashlight. Her hands were shaking. She stood in front of that wall for a long time. The photographs stared back at her, each one a stolen moment from a life she thought no one had been watching. But someone had. Someone had stood in the shadows of her childhood, year after year, and documented every bruise, every milestone, every quiet moment when she thought she was completely alone. And the only explanation was a man she had never met. A grandfather whose name she hadn't known until yesterday. A dead man who, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand, had built a cabin on a mountain and filled its walls with proof that someone had cared. Nora pressed her back against the cabin wall and slid to the floor. The backpack fell beside her. The flashlight rolled across the planks, its beam cutting a line across the ceiling. She didn't cry. She had trained herself out of that years ago. But something cracked behind her ribs that night. Something that had been locked tight since she was 10 years old and learned that no one was coming for her. It didn't break. Not yet. But for the first time in her life, Nora felt it give. She sat there on the floor of the cabin that Walter Colton had built, surrounded by the photographs of a life she thought no one had seen, and she held the rusted key against her chest. Outside, the mountain was silent. The moon hung above the ridge like a lantern in an empty room, and somewhere in the quiet, the wind moved through the pines and sounded almost like someone breathing. Nora woke on the cabin floor with the first gray light of dawn pressing through the windows. Her neck was stiff and her back ached from sleeping against the wall. But for a moment she didn't move. She lay still, listening. Wind in the trees, the distant murmur of the stream behind the cabin. A bird somewhere close repeating the same 3 notes like a question it couldn't stop asking. She sat up slowly and looked at the photographs above the fireplace. In the daylight, they were sharper, more detailed. She could see things she had missed in the dark, the way the photographer had always kept a respectful distance. The careful framing. Whoever had taken them had done so with patience, never intruding, never stepping close enough to be seen. Nora stood and walked to the desk beneath the window. A thin layer of dust covered the surface, but beneath it the wood was smooth and well oiled. A pen sat in a groove along the back edge. A reading lamp with a green glass shade stood to one side. And in the center of the desk, a single framed photograph faced the chair. She picked it up. A man in his late 70s stood beside a half-built cabin frame, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a level in one hand, and a pencil behind his ear. His face was weathered and lined, but his eyes were sharp, clear, the kind of eyes that didn't miss things. He wasn't smiling in the photograph, but something in his expression suggested satisfaction. The quiet pride of a man building something with his own hands for someone he would never get to meet. Walter Colton. Nora set the photograph back on the desk. Her fingers lingered on the frame for a moment longer than necessary. Then she noticed the floor. Beneath the desk, partially hidden by a woven rug, was a seam in the floorboards. Nora knelt and pulled the rug aside. A trap door about 2 feet square was set flush into the planks. A recessed metal ring served as the handle. The wood around it was darker than the rest of the floor, as if it had been opened and closed many times. Nora wrapped her fingers around the ring and pulled. The door lifted with a soft groan, releasing a breath of cool, stale air from below. A narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness. Nora grabbed her flashlight and pointed the beam down. The stairs were solid, each step reinforced with metal brackets. Whoever had built this hadn't cut corners. She went down. The basement was smaller than the cabin above, maybe 15 feet by 12, with a low ceiling that forced Nora to duck slightly. But it was dry well ventilated through a narrow shaft in the corner and meticulously organized. Shelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound journals filled the top shelves, each one labeled with a year on the spine. The earliest read 2009. The most recent 2024. 16 years of records. Below the journals were neatly labeled boxes. School records, medical, legal correspondence, county reports, each one marked with the same steady handwriting Nora recognized from the notes. A work table sat against the far wall. On it rested an old film projector, several stacks of videotapes, and a metal box that looked newer than everything else in the room. Unlike the dusty shelves around it, the box was clean, polished. Someone had placed it there recently, within the last few months, maybe the last few weeks. Nora set down her flashlight and lifted the lid. 3 items inside. A thick envelope, yellowed but sealed with care. A stack of legal documents bound with a rubber band. And a small digital voice recorder, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. A green light blinked on its side, indicating a full charge. Nora picked up the recorder. Her thumb found the play button. She held it there for a moment, her pulse loud in the quiet room. Then she pressed it. Static. A faint hiss like a radio searching for a signal. Then a voice. Deep. Slow. Worn by age, but steady, the voice of a man who had spent a long time choosing his words before speaking them. Nora, if you're hearing this, it means you found the place. She stopped breathing. I wish I could have said all of this to your face. I planned to. For years I planned to. But plans have a way of falling apart when the people around you won't let them stand. Nora lowered herself into the wooden chair beside the work table. The recorder rested in her open palm. The Colton family is not what it looks like from the outside, Walter's voice continued. They smile at charity dinners. They shake hands at board meetings. They write checks to hospitals with their name on the building. But behind closed doors, Nora, they are wolves. They have been for 3 generations. And I spent most of my life as one of them before I understood what it cost. The recording paused. When it resumed, Walter's voice was quieter. Your mother, Catherine, was the kindest person I ever knew. She married my son David because she believed people could change. She was wrong. David had the Colton sickness in him, the need to control everything, to own everything, to turn every relationship into a transaction. When Catherine became pregnant with you, David was already gone. Not dead. Gone. He owed money to people who don't send letters. Gambling debts, bad deals, the kind of holes you can't climb out of. He disappeared 3 weeks before you were born. Nora's jaw tightened. The orphanage had told her both parents were deceased. That was the only story she had ever been given. Catherine died bringing you into the world, Walter said. Complications during delivery. She was 26 years old. The room was very still. I tried to take you in. The day after Catherine passed, I filed for custody. But the family Philip, the lawyers, the accountants, they blocked it. Philip was my elder son Sterling and Margot's father. He ran the family by then, and he said I was too old, too unstable, too fixated. The truth is, he was afraid. If I raised you, you would have had a legal claim to the Colton Trust when you turned 21. Philip couldn't allow that. So he made sure you went into the system, and he made sure you stayed there. Nora realized her hands were clenched so tightly around the recorder that her knuckles had gone white. She forced herself to breathe. I could have fought harder, Walter said. Maybe I should have. But I knew what a court battle would do. They would have dragged Catherine's name through the mud. They would have painted me as a senile old man trying to steal a child for inheritance purposes. And you, Nora, you would have been caught in the middle of it. A baby being fought over like property. I couldn't do that to you. The recording paused again. When Walter spoke next, his voice carried something Nora had never heard directed at her before. It took her a moment to recognize it as love. So, I watched you from a distance. Every report card, every school photograph, every time you moved to a new foster placement, I knew about it within a week. The journals on these shelves, they're yours. Every one of them is about you. Nora looked at the rows of leather spines. 16 years. 16 volumes of a life recorded by a man standing in the shadows. I built this cabin for you, not as a gift, as a foundation. Everything you need to survive up here is already in place. The solar panels will run for another 20 years. The greenhouse can produce food through most of the winter. The stream has never gone dry in the 40 years I've known this mountain. The recorder clicked softly as the file ended. A second file began automatically. There's one more thing you need to know. Walter's voice was different now, harder, more deliberate. The inheritance Sterling and Margot received is not what they think it is. I structured those assets very carefully over the last decade. The properties carry liens and tax obligations that exceed their market value. The company's shares are tied to entities that are currently under federal review. The investment accounts have withdrawal restrictions that will trigger audit flags the moment they try to access them. Nora leaned forward. Within 12 months, everything they inherited will collapse under its own weight. I didn't leave them a fortune, Nora. I left them a mirror. They'll see exactly who they are when there's nothing left to hide behind. The recording ended. Nora set the recorder on the table and opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, 8 pages long, and a set of financial documents. The letter repeated much of what the recording had said, but added details. Names of the investigators Walter had hired to track Nora's progress through the foster system. Contact information for Carl Jennings, a man Walter described as the only honest friend he'd ever had. Instructions for maintaining the cabin through winter. And a final paragraph that Nora read 3 times. This land is not a consolation prize. It is everything I have that is real. The rest of the Colton fortune is smoke. This mountain, this cabin, this water, this soil, this is what lasts. If you can survive a winter up here, you can survive anything. And if you can survive anything, then the Coltons have already lost. The financial documents confirmed everything. Page after page of records showing Shell Company's offshore accounts and transactions linked to Sterling and Margot that bordered on fraud. Wire transfers routed through entities that existed only on paper. Tax filings that didn't match reported income. Contracts with signatures that appeared on documents the signers claimed never to have seen. Walter hadn't just left evidence. He had built a case, methodical, complete, ready to be delivered to federal authorities at any time. Nora closed the folder and sat in the dim basement for a long time. The shelves full of journals surrounded her like the walls of a library built for an audience of one. She thought about the man in the photograph upstairs, standing beside the half-built frame of this cabin, a level in his hand and a look of quiet purpose on his face. He had spent years building this, not just the cabin, the plan, the protection, every piece placed with the patience of a man who knew he was running out of time. Nora climbed back up the stairs and walked outside. The morning sun sat above the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. The stream behind the cabin caught the light and scattered it into 1,000 fragments. The greenhouse glass glowed. The solar panels hummed with a faint electrical whisper. Nora stood on the porch and looked out at the mountain and the valley below, and the endless green forest that stretched in every direction. For the first time since she had left the orphanage, something shifted inside her chest. Not hope. She didn't trust hope. But recognition. The quiet understanding that this place had not been left to her carelessly. It had been built for her by a man who had carried the weight of her absence for 18 years. She didn't feel grateful yet. Gratitude would come later if it came at all. What she felt was something harder to name. A sense that for the first time in her life, she owed it to someone to try. Then winter came, and the mountain tried to kill her. The first snowfall arrived in early November, 3 weeks after Nora moved in. It came gently, almost politely, a thin dusting that turned the clearing white and made the cabin look like something from a postcard. Nora watched it from the window and thought it was beautiful. By December, she had stopped thinking that. The storms came in waves, each one heavier than the last. Wind screamed through the valley at night with the sound like tearing metal. Snow piled against the cabin walls in drifts that reached the windowsills. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero on the worst nights, and the cold wasn't something you felt on your skin. It was something that crawled inside you, settled into your bones, and whispered that you didn't belong here. The water line froze first. The pipe that ran from the stream to the cabin's hand pump seized up overnight, and Nora spent an entire morning digging through snow with bare hands to find the blockage. By the time she cleared it, her fingers were so numb she couldn't feel them for 2 hours. Then the solar panels failed. A heavy layer of ice built up on the south-facing panels after 3 consecutive days of freezing rain, cutting power to the cabin. No lights, no charging for the flashlight, no power for the small radio she had found in the kitchen. Nora climbed onto the roof with the broom and cleared the ice by hand, the wind pulling at her jacket with a force that wanted her off the ridge. Then the tree fell. It happened at 2 in the morning during the worst storm of January. A massive pine weakened by ice and wind cracked at its base with a sound like a rifle shot and crashed into the clearing. It missed the cabin by 8 feet, but it landed directly on the water pipe, crushing a 6-foot section into the frozen ground. Nora spent 4 hours in the dark in the snow, in temperatures that made her lungs burn with every breath, digging out the damaged pipe and rigging a temporary repair with materials she found in the small tool shed behind the cabin. She worked by flashlight. She worked with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the wrench. She worked because there was no one else to do it. By the time she finished, her jeans were frozen stiff below the knee, and she couldn't feel her feet. She stumbled back inside, built a fire with trembling hands, and sat in front of it until the shaking stopped. It didn't stop for a long time. That was the night Nora almost quit. She sat on the porch the next morning, wrapped in every blanket she owned, looking down at the valley below. The storm had passed. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. The world was white and silent and impossibly still. She thought about the bus station in Philadelphia, the bench where she had sat with the key in her hand. She thought about the shelters on the list the county woman had given her. She thought about how easy it would be to walk back down the mountain, catch a bus south, and find a warm bed in a place where pipes didn't freeze and trees didn't crash in the middle of the night. She could leave. No one would know. No one would care. Nora sat with that thought for a long time. It was the closest she had ever come to giving up. Not in the orphanage, not in the worst foster homes, not during any of the moments that had shaped her into the person she was. This was different. This was the mountain asking her a question she didn't know how to answer. Then she went back inside and found the journal. It was tucked behind the others on the basement shelf in a different color binding than the rest. Dark red instead of brown. No year on the spine, just 2 words in Walter's handwriting. For winter. Nora opened it. The first page held a single paragraph. If you're reading this, it means the mountain has shown you its teeth. Good. That means you're still here. The people who leave don't go looking for answers. They just go. The fact that you opened this book tells me everything I need to know about who you are. The journal was different from the others. It wasn't a record of Nora's life. It was a record of Walter's. His own winters on the mountain. The storms he had survived. The pipes he had fixed. The nights he had spent alone, wondering if he had made the right choices. It was written directly to her as if he were sitting across the table. The cold will test you harder than any person ever has. But here's the thing about the cold, Nora. It doesn't lie. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't pretend to care about you and then disappear in the middle of the night. It just is. And once you learn to survive something honest, the dishonest things lose their power over you. Nora read the entire journal that morning. When she finished, she closed it, placed it back on the shelf, and went outside to fix the pipe properly. She didn't think about leaving again. Spring came to Pine Ridge the way spring comes to mountain towns reluctantly. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, pulling back into the shadows of the north-facing slopes, where it would linger until May. The stream behind the cabin swelled with runoff, and the clearing turned to mud before the first green shoots appeared. Nora walked into town for the first time in months. She needed supplies, nails and wire for the greenhouse seeds for the spring planting, and a new blade for the handsaw. The trail down the mountain felt different now. Shorter somehow. Familiar. Ruth Hayward was behind the counter at the gas station, same as before. She looked up when Nora walked in, and this time there was no hesitation in her expression. Just a slow nod of recognition. "You made it through the winter," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Barely," Nora said. Ruth studied her for a moment. Your grandfather used to say the same thing. Every spring he'd come down that mountain looking like he'd gone 10 rounds with God and lost half of them, but he always came back. Nora crossed the street to the hardware store, a narrow building with warped floorboards and shelves stacked to the ceiling with everything from roofing nails to kerosene lamps. The owner, a wiry man in his 70s named Haskell, looked at her over the rim of his glasses and said nothing while she gathered her supplies. When she brought them to the counter, he rang them up and then quietly subtracted 20%. "Friend of Walter's?" Nora asked. "Everybody up here was a friend of Walter's," Haskell said, whether they knew it or not. She was loading the supplies into a canvas bag outside the store when a man appeared from around the corner. Tall, early 60s with wide shoulders and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of physical work. His face was deeply line-tanned even in early spring, and his gray hair was cut short. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. "Carl Jennings," Ruth called from across the street, leaning in the doorway of the gas station. "He helped your grandfather build that cabin." Carl looked at Nora with an expression that was hard to read. Not suspicion, not warmth, something in between. Appraisal. "You're Walter's girl," he said. Not a question either. "I'm Nora. I know who you are. He talked about you every time I saw him." Carl leaned against the porch post. "You fixed that water line yourself." Nora blinked. "How did you know it broke?" "Because it breaks every winter. The angle's wrong where it crosses the rock shelf. Walter and I argued about it for 2 years. He said it built character. I said it built pneumonia." For the first time in months, Nora almost smiled. Carl became a quiet, steady presence over the following weeks. He didn't offer help. He offered knowledge. He showed Nora how to re-angle the water pipe so it wouldn't freeze at the rock shelf. He taught her to split wood along the grain instead of against it, which saved her hours. He showed her which wild plants on the mountain were edible and which ones would send her to a hospital she couldn't afford. On a rainy afternoon in April, after they had finished reinforcing the greenhouse frame, Carl leaned against his truck and said, "You know how to drive?" Nora shook her head. "Figured as much." He tossed her the keys to his old Ford pickup. "Start it up. I'll teach you. Can't live on a mountain and not know how to get off it in an emergency." It took Nora 3 lessons on the dirt road before she stopped grinding the gears, and 2 more before Carl stopped bracing himself against the dashboard. By the end of May, she could drive the mountain road without stalling, and Carl left the truck at the cabin for a week at a time so she could make supply runs on her own. He never pushed. He never gave advice unless she asked. And he never once treated her like a child or a charity case. He treated her the way you treat someone who has earned the right to learn. One afternoon while they were restaking the greenhouse fence, Carl told her something that stopped her cold. "Walter planned to bring you up here when you were 16, he said, driving a post into the soft ground. Had the whole thing set up. Was going to pull you out of the system, get a lawyer file for guardianship again. Said he was done waiting." Nora stared at him. "What happened?" Carl's jaw tightened. "Sterling happened. That cousin of yours found out Walter was in contact with the family court attorney. Don't know how. Probably had someone watching the old man's mail or his phone. Within a week, Sterling's lawyers filed a motion to have Walter declared mentally incompetent. They wanted conservatorship, Full control of his assets, his property, everything. The post driver hit the ground with a heavy thud. Walter had to back off. If he pushed the custody case, Sterling would have used it as evidence that he was unstable. Obsessed, they would have called it. A delusional old man fixated on a grandchild he'd never met. Carl looked at Nora. So he changed the plan. Rewrote the will. Set everything up so it would only activate after he was gone. That way, Sterling couldn't block it. Nora stood very still in the spring sunlight, the hammer in her hand forgotten. Walter hadn't just been watching her from a distance. He had been fighting for her. Quietly, strategically, with the patience of a man who knew that the only way to win against the Coltons was to outlast them. Summer burned through the valley, and Nora worked. The greenhouse expanded. The garden produced more than she could eat alone, and she began trading surplus vegetables with Ruth for supplies at the gas station. The cabin felt less like a test now, and more like a home. She patched the roof, reinforced the porch, built a new woodshed from lumber. Carl helped her source from a fallen oak. By September, Nora had been on the mountain for 11 months. She was leaner, stronger, and quieter than the girl who had stepped off the bus in Pine Ridge. The mountain had done what Walter said it would. It had stripped away everything that didn't matter and left only what was real. She was splitting wood behind the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard the engine, not the sputter of a local truck or the rattle of Carl's old pickup. This was something heavier, smoother, the sound of money moving through a place where money didn't belong. A black SUV climbed the dirt road and rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing. 2 doors opened. Sterling stepped out first. He was wearing a wool overcoat that probably cost more than every tool in Nora's shed combined. His shoes were polished leather, completely wrong for the terrain, and they sank into the soft earth the moment he stepped off the road. Behind him, Margot emerged in a tailored jacket, her expression rigid, unreadable. A third man stepped from the passenger side, a lawyer judging by the briefcase and the practiced blankness of his face. Behind the SUV, a county sheriff's cruiser idled with 2 deputies sitting inside. Sterling looked at the cabin, then at Nora, then at the axe in her hand. A slow grin spread across his face. "Well," he said, "look at that." The stray built herself a little homestead. The lawyer stepped forward and opened his briefcase on the hood of the SUV. "Miss Colton, we're here on behalf of the Colton estate to review the legal status of this property. There are questions regarding the validity of the deed transfer, and we're requesting your cooperation in a formal reassessment." Nora set the axe down slowly. She didn't speak. "We believe," the lawyer continued, "that Mr. Walter Colton was not of sound mind at the time the will was executed, and that this property was transferred under conditions that may not meet the legal threshold for a valid bequest." Sterling's grin widened. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked inside the cabin. She was gone for less than a minute. When she came back out, she was carrying a thick folder. She placed it on the porch table, opened it, and spread the documents across the surface. "These are copies," she said, her voice even and unhurried. "The originals are in a secure location off this property." The lawyer picked up the first page. His expression didn't change immediately, but as he turned to the second page, then the third, the color began to leave his face. He flipped faster. Each page was worse than the last. Financial records, wire transfers, shell company registrations, tax filings that contradicted sworn statements. And at the center of it all, Sterling and Margot's names over and over, tied to transactions that weren't just suspicious, but prosecutable. Sterling's grin was gone. Nora spoke quietly. If either of you files a single motion against this property, these documents go to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. Every page, every account number, every signature. The clearing was very quiet. The stream murmured behind the cabin. A crow called once from the top of a dead pine and then went silent. Sterling's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then Margot moved. She turned away from the table, walked to the SUV, and opened the door. Sterling stared at her. "What are you doing?" he said. Margot didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead through the windshield at the mountain and the trees and the sky above them. "I'm done, Sterling," she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted, not angry, just finished. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not filing anything. I'm done." Sterling's face went red. "You can't be serious." Margot closed the door. Sterling looked at the lawyer. The lawyer was still reading the documents, his face a shade paler than it had been 2 minutes ago. He quietly gathered his briefcase and walked back to the SUV without a word. Sterling stood alone in the clearing. For one brief moment, his mask slipped, and Nora saw something beneath it she hadn't expected. Not anger, fear. Then he turned, climbed into the SUV, and the black vehicle rolled back down the dirt road and disappeared into the trees. Nora stood on the porch and watched the dust settle. The clearing was still again. The stream ran on. The wind pressed through the high branches with its slow, patient rhythm, steady as a pulse. Nora picked up the folder, carried it inside, and closed the door. The collapse came faster than even Walter had predicted. By October, 2 weeks after Sterling's visit to the mountain, the first cracks appeared in the Colton empire. A financial news outlet published a story about irregularities in one of the holding companies Sterling had inherited. The article was small, buried in the business section, but it triggered an internal review by the company's board of directors. Within days, auditors discovered discrepancies in the quarterly filings that stretched back 3 years. Sterling fired his accountant. Then he fired his financial advisor. Then he hired a crisis management firm that charged $40,000 a month and told him to stop talking to reporters. It didn't help. By November, the Aspen property was under a tax lien. The Malibu house, which Sterling had been using as collateral for a private loan, was flagged by the lender when they discovered the property's title was entangled with an offshore entity that didn't legally exist. The investment accounts Walter had structured with withdrawal restrictions began triggering automated audit notifications the moment Sterling tried to move funds. Every door Sterling opened led to another locked room. Every asset he touched turned to sand in his hands. The fortune he had accepted with such confidence in that Philadelphia conference room was unraveling thread by thread, exactly as Walter had designed it to. Nora followed the news from the cabin. Carl brought her a newspaper once a week when he came up the mountain to help with the woodshed expansion, and Ruth saved clippings from the business pages at the gas station. Nora read each one carefully, then filed them in the basement alongside Walter's documents. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt the quiet, unsettling weight of watching something inevitable play out in slow motion. Your grandfather spent 10 years setting those dominoes, Carl said one afternoon, reading over her shoulder. All he had to do was die to knock the first one over. Nora didn't respond. She was thinking about the man in the photograph on the desk upstairs, the level in his hand, the careful eyes. A man who had understood that the most powerful thing you could build wasn't a fortune. It was a trap that looked like one. The knock came on a Thursday night in late November. Nora was reading by the fireplace when she heard it. Not a polite knock. Heavy, uneven, the kind of knocking that comes from someone who has stopped caring about courtesy. She set the book down and listened. The knocking came again, harder, followed by a voice she recognized immediately. Open the door, Nora. Sterling. She crossed the room and opened the door. The man standing on her porch looked nothing like the polished figure who had smirked at her across the conference table 13 months ago. His overcoat was wrinkled and stained at the cuffs. His hair, always so precisely styled, was uncombed and falling across his forehead. His eyes were bloodshot, and the smell of whiskey reached Nora before his words did. "Can I come in?" he said. It wasn't a demand. It was barely even a question. It was the sound of a man who had run out of places to go. Nora stepped aside. Sterling walked in and stood in the middle of the cabin, swaying slightly. He looked at the bookshelves, the fireplace, the wall where the photographs hung. His gaze lingered on the images of Nora as a child, and something moved across his face too fast and too complicated to name. "He watched you," Sterling said quietly. "The whole time. He watched you." "Yes." Sterling dropped into the chair beside the desk. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. "It's gone," Sterling said finally. His voice was hoarse. "All of it. The houses, the accounts, the shares. Every lawyer I call tells me the same thing. The structures are toxic. The liabilities exceed the assets. I can't sell, I can't borrow. I can't restructure." He laughed, a short, broken sound. "The old man handed us a grenade and we thanked him for it." Nora sat across from him and said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the most honest response you could give. Sterling lifted his head and looked at her. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was past that. He had reached a place beyond tears where everything becomes very clear and very quiet. "I wasn't always like this," he said. Nora waited. "When I was 22, I found out about you. My father, Philip, told me, sat me down in his study and explained that Walter had a grandchild in the foster system, and that under no circumstances was anyone in the family to contact you. He said you were a liability, a loose thread that could unravel the trust structure if you ever filed a claim." Sterling stared at the floor. I didn't argue with him. I should have, but I didn't. That's how it works in that family. You learn early that disagreement has consequences, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A kid growing up in the system alone, and we had more money than we could spend in 3 lifetimes. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "So I did something stupid," Sterling said. "Something my father would have destroyed me for if he'd found out." Nora felt something tighten in her chest. A memory she hadn't thought about in years was rising to the surface. "I sent you a letter," Sterling said. "You were about 10. I didn't sign it. I couldn't. If my father traced it back to me, he would have cut me off completely. but I wanted you to know that someone out there knew you existed." The room tilted. Nora stood slowly. She walked to her backpack, which hung on a hook by the door. She unzipped the smallest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, so old and soft it felt like cloth. She carried it back to the firelight and held it out. Sterling looked at it. His face crumbled. "Be patient," he read, his voice barely above a whisper. "There will come a time when everything becomes clear." "You wrote this," Nora said. Sterling nodded. He couldn't speak. Nora stood there holding the note that had lived in her pocket for 8 years. The note she had read on her worst nights in the orphanage, when the darkness felt permanent and the silence felt like proof that no one in the world was thinking about her. She had always imagined it was from a stranger, a kind stranger, maybe a teacher or a volunteer or someone who had seen her through a window and felt a moment of compassion. She had never imagined it was from the man who had called her astray. "What happened to you?" Nora asked. Not with anger, with something closer to grief. Sterling wiped his face with the back of his hand. "The family happened," he said. "The same thing that would have happened to you. My father spent the next 10 years making sure I understood that sentiment was weakness, that empathy was a flaw, that the only thing that mattered was the name and the money and the control." He looked at the photographs on the wall. Walter was right. About all of it. About what they would do to me. About what they would have done to you. He stood up unsteady on his feet and walked to the door. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said with his back to her. "I don't deserve that. But I wanted you to know that there was a moment a long time ago when I was still someone who cared." He opened the door and stepped into the cold. Nora watched him walk across the clearing toward the trail. He moved slowly, his expensive shoes slipping on the frozen ground, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He looked like a man walking away from the last thing he had left. Nora closed the door and stood in the quiet cabin for a long time. She looked at the note in her hand, then at the wall above the fireplace. Two people separated by money and time, and a family that consumed everything it touched, and the only thread between them was a single sentence written on a piece of paper 8 years ago by a young man who still had enough humanity left to reach out to a child he had never met. She folded the note carefully and put it back in her pocket. 3 weeks later, Margot came. She arrived alone on foot, having walked the trail from Pine Ridge in boots that were practical and a jacket that was warm but not expensive. She looked different from the woman in the conference room, thinner, quieter. The rigid posture was gone, replaced by something that looked less like control and more like exhaustion. She carried a small wooden box under her arm. Nora met her at the porch. They stood facing each other for a moment without speaking. The December air was cold and still, and their breath made small clouds between them. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Margot said. "I just need to show you something." They sat at the kitchen table. Margot placed the box between them and opened the lid. Inside were photographs, old ones printed on thick paper with scalloped edges. The kind of photographs people took in the 60s and 70s. A woman with dark hair and a wide, generous smile, standing in a garden with her hands covered in soil. The same woman holding a baby in a hospital room, looking exhausted and radiant. The woman sitting beside a much younger Walter at a kitchen table, both of them laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. "That's Eleanor," Margot said. Walter's wife, your grandmother, she died in 1987. Nora touched the edge of one photograph gently. I've had these since I was 12, Margot said. I found them in a box in the attic of the family house. My mother told me to throw them away. She said Eleanor was nobody important. Margot paused. I kept them hidden in my closet for 16 years. Nora looked up. I grew up in that family the same way Sterling did, Margot said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it like a wire pulled taut. Every feeling I had was corrected. Every instinct I followed was redirected. I learned to sit straight, to smile at the right time, to say the right thing to the right people. I learned that love was a word you used in Christmas cards, not something you were allowed to actually feel. She looked at the photographs of Eleanor. Your grandmother was the last person in that family who was real. After she died, something broke in Walter. And something broke in the family too, but in a different way. They got harder, colder, more efficient, like a machine that had lost its only human part. The kitchen was quiet, except for the low hiss of the fire in the next room. I should have said something at the reading of the will, Margot said. When Sterling laughed at you, when Prescott slid that envelope across the table and everyone in the room treated you like you didn't matter. I should have said something. Why didn't you? Nora asked. Margot met her eyes. Because I was afraid. Because that's what growing up Colton does to you. It makes you afraid of the only things worth doing. They didn't hug. They didn't make promises. Margot left the box of photographs on the table and walked back down the mountain before the sun went down. But something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Something smaller and more honest than either of those things. An acknowledgement that they had both been shaped by the same machine and that the machine had failed to finish the job. Nora placed Eleanor's photographs on the mantel beside Walter's. Two people she had never known, looking out from a past she had never been part of, and yet somehow they felt more like family than anyone she had ever met. Winter passed easier the second time. Nora knew the mountain now, its rhythms, its warnings, the way it groaned before a storm and went silent before the coldest nights. She had stockpiled enough firewood to last through March. The greenhouse expanded and, reinforced with Carl's help, produced greens and root vegetables even in January. The water line, re-angled to avoid the rock shelf, didn't freeze once. By spring, the cabin had changed. Not just physically, though. The new woodshed and the expanded garden and the repaired porch were visible from the trail. Something about the place felt different, warmer, more alive, like a house that had spent years holding its breath and was finally exhaling. Nora spent March and April building. A second small structure, simple but solid, went up 50 yards from the main cabin. Carl showed her how to lay a foundation and frame the walls. Ruth donated a set of bunk beds that had been sitting in her garage since her own children grew up and moved away. Haskell at the hardware store gave Nora a discount on lumber that was almost certainly a loss for him, but he waved off her protests with a shrug and a mumbled comment about Walter having done the same for him 20 years back. In May, Nora drove Carl's truck down to the county seat and walked into the Department of Social Services. She sat across from a caseworker and explained what she wanted to do. The caseworker looked skeptical. A young woman not yet 20 with no income, no degree, and a cabin in the mountains was not the typical profile for someone offering to house aging out foster youth. But Nora had come prepared. She had the property deed, the trust fund documentation letters of reference from Ruth and Carl, a detailed plan for the property's sustainable food and energy systems, and a quiet, steady confidence that made the caseworker pause. "I'm not asking to adopt anyone," Nora said. "I'm offering a place to land, a roof, a meal, and someone who understands what it feels like to walk out of the system with nothing." The paperwork took 2 months. Background checks, site inspections, safety certifications. Nora passed every one. On a warm afternoon in late July, an old school bus climbed slowly up the dirt road to the cabin. The engine coughed and rattled on the steep grade, and the suspension groaned over every rut and rock. Nora stood by the gate at the edge of the clearing and watched it come. The bus door opened and 6 teenagers stepped out one by one, blinking in the mountain sunlight. They carried backpacks and duffel bags, and the same expression Nora recognized from her own face 13 months ago. Guarded, wary, braced for disappointment. The last one off the bus was a girl. 16 years old, small for her age, with short, dark hair and eyes that moved constantly, scanning the clearing, the cabin, the trees, the sky, cataloging everything, and trusting nothing. She held her bag against her chest, the way Nora had held her backpack in the conference room in Philadelphia. Her name was Wren. Nora looked at her and saw herself. Not a reflection, but an echo. The same watchfulness, the same hardness around the edges, the same stubborn refusal to believe that anything good could happen without a cost attached. Nora walked to the group and stood in front of them. She didn't give a speech. She didn't make promises about how everything was going to be different now. She had heard enough empty promises in her life to know they were worse than silence. "This is the cabin," she said simply. "There's food in the kitchen, beds in the new house, hot water if the sun's been out." She paused. "And one rule. Out here, nobody gets left behind." The teenagers stared at her. Wren stared the longest. That evening after dinner, after the others had settled into the bunkhouse and the clearing was quiet, Nora went down to the basement. She had been meaning to reorganize the shelves for weeks, moving Walter's journals into chronological order and boxing up the financial documents that were no longer needed now that Sterling's empire had completed its collapse. She pulled the last box from the bottom shelf, and something shifted behind it. A panel in the wall made of the same wood as the shelving was sitting slightly ajar. Nora set the box down and pressed her fingers against the edge of the panel. It swung open on a hidden hinge. Behind it was a narrow space barely a foot deep. Inside was a single item, a sealed envelope thick and heavy with one word written on the front in Walter's handwriting: Nora. She carried it upstairs and sat at the desk. The cabin was dark except for the lamp with the green glass shade. Outside, she could hear the faint sounds of the teenagers talking in the bunkhouse, their voices carrying across the clearing like something fragile and new. She opened the envelope. Inside was a legal document notarized and dated 18 months before Walter's death. A second will, separate from the one read in the Philadelphia conference room, filed with a different law firm in a different state under a sealed provision that could only be activated under specific conditions. The conditions were two: First, the named beneficiary must have maintained continuous residence on the mountain property for a minimum of 12 calendar months. Second, the named beneficiary must have used the property to provide shelter or assistance to at least one person in need. Nora read the next paragraph 3 times. Upon fulfillment of these conditions, the Walter Colton Irrevocable Trust, containing the sum total of Walter Colton's primary financial holdings, valued at the time of this document's execution at approximately $14.7 million, shall transfer in full to the named beneficiary, Nora Colton, to be administered at her sole discretion. Nora set the document on the desk. She sat very still for a long time. $14.7 million. The Aspen house was worth $2 million encumbered by debt. The Malibu property, $1.5 buried in liens. Sterling and Margot's combined inheritance after the collapse was worth less than nothing. It was a monument to everything the Colton family had built on sand. And here, hidden behind a panel in a basement on a mountain that most people would never find, was the real fortune. The one Walter had kept separate from the family's poisoned assets. The one he had protected for decades, waiting for the right person to earn it. Not inherit it. Earn it. Nora understood now. The cabin wasn't a consolation prize. It wasn't even a test, not really. It was a filter. Walter had known that anyone who could survive a winter on this mountain, anyone who could face Sterling and Margot, and not flinch, anyone who could take a place built for one person and open it to others, that person could be trusted with the thing the Colton family had never been able to handle. Real wealth. The kind that doesn't collapse. The kind that builds. Nora folded the document and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't feel rich. She didn't feel victorious. She felt the same quiet, steady weight she had carried since the day she opened the cabin door and saw her own childhood staring back at her from the wall. Responsibility. She turned off the lamp and walked outside. The clearing was silver with moonlight. The bunkhouse windows glowed faintly. Somewhere inside, one of the teenagers laughed a short, surprised sound, as if laughter were something they were still learning how to do. The stream behind the cabin caught the light and carried it downstream in scattered, shining pieces. Nora stood on the porch and looked at the mountain and the sky and the dark line of pines that circled the clearing like the walls of a cathedral, built by no one and everyone at once. She thought about Walter standing in this same spot, building this place board by board for a granddaughter he would never meet. She thought about Eleanor smiling in a garden with soil on her hands. She thought about Sterling at 22 secretly mailing a letter to a child he had been told to forget. She thought about Margot carrying a box of hidden photographs down a mountain in December because keeping them secret had become heavier than the walk. She thought about the girl on the bus this afternoon. Wren, 16 years old, holding her bag against her chest, scanning the clearing with eyes that trusted nothing. Nora had been that girl, and someone she never met had spent 18 years making sure that girl would have a place to stand when the world finally let go of her. The wind moved through the pines, not the howling wind of January that had tried to tear the roof from the cabin. Not the sharp cutting wind of the first night she had climbed this trail alone in the dark. This was a different kind of wind, low and warm and steady, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth and the distant sweetness of wildflowers opening somewhere on the south slope. Nora closed her eyes and listened, and somewhere in the quiet, in the space between the wind and the water, and the slow breathing of a mountain that had seen 100 years of people come and go, she heard something that sounded very much like a man saying, "Well done." She opened her eyes. The stars were out. Every single one of them. Nora went inside, checked the fire, and left the porch light on for the night. Not because anyone was coming, but because that was what you did when the people inside were yours.